Who are we? You sure you want to know?
We're your friendly neighborhood podcast hosts, Sean
And Peter. And in this episode of our Sam Raimi Spider-Man podcast, we're going to be talking about a Tom Holland Spider-Man movie.
Boy, that multiverse sure is crazy.
Hey everyone! As the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man might say as he was showing up to a Thanksgiving dinner after grabbing a can of cranberry sauce, or as the Tom Holland Spider-Man might say as he was showing up to a fight after grabbing Captain America's shield. Just a little inter-franchise symmetry right there to start off the show. But another thing that we should start off with should be a big spoiler warning, because usually on this show we're talking about films that came out in the 2000s. But this episode is about a film released much more recently.
We are talking about Spider-Man: No Way Home, directed by John Watts and written by Chris McKenna and Eric Summers, who also wrote Far From Home and co-wrote Homecoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is kind of a special treat because Peter and I started planning this podcast over a year ago, and it's really cool that we're mainly talking about movies that came out so long ago, but now we're able to talk about a movie that's very, very current.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a special treat for us, Peter, that we get to really see the movies that were a big part of our childhood now merge with movies that are a big part of our present too, and something that we enjoy today. The Tom Holland Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, this movie was a special treat, absolutely. Not directed by Sam Raimi, of course, but it still falls under our mission of discussing the Sam Raimi Spider-Man franchise because it has not only the return of several characters from that franchise, but like a substantial return of characters from that franchise.
Oh yeah, not just brief cameos, but I mean real substantial, important plot roles for the movie here. So yes, definitely quite a bit to sink our teeth into as we dissect this movie.
And as the name of the show states, no matter whether we're in the Raimiverse or the Wattsverse, there is so much to tell. So this is going to be another two-part episode, hot on the heels of another two-parter all about the Green Goblin.
So naturally, the first episode of our No Way Home two-parter should also focus on the Green Goblin.
You just cannot get enough of the Green Goblin discussion, can you, Sean?
I can't help myself. I really can't. I'm just a glutton for the Green Goblin.
He is extremely cool. It is nice to check in again on our old nemesis Norman, see what dastardly doings he's been up to lately. But before we get into that, I think we should start off with our initial reaction seeing it. We saw it together a couple days after it came out. And I know, when we get to that bridge scene, we all knew it was coming from the trailer. But I remember at the time you leaned over and you were like, here we go, because we all knew it. And then, Peter starts sensing trouble. We hear there's eerie strains of Danny Elfman's Doc Ock theme. And I was just thrilled. I probably had the biggest smile on my face, leading up to when that mechanical claw smashes into the frame and then finally reveals Alfred Molina. And then we had a huge, awesome action set piece out of that to begin with. Mind-boggling, really.
Yeah, no, it was very exciting. Yeah, seeing Tom Holland Spider-Man face off against Dr. Octopus like that. And it was interesting too because the Tom Holland Spider-Man had. And Dr. Octopus noticed this. He had some new weapons. He had some gadgetry from his enhanced spider suit that, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man did not have all those years ago. So it was interesting to see the battle, even the combat itself was quite different from what we saw the last time we battled Dr. Octopus.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to see the fight play out and just the combat. And
I agree. Well, it's just
pugilism itself was done in a different way.
Mind-boggling. It just boggles my mind because, another thing going into this movie, I know it's going to be those actors. I know they look like the characters, but I still wasn't completely sure. Are they going to be playing really the exact characters or just characters very similar? And no, it was very clear. He's looking for his machine. He's trying to get the power of the sun in the palm of his hand. So we have that classic Doc Ock, like you said, he's throwing cars and things like we've seen before, but he's also fighting the Iron Spider. And then he's talking with Doctor Strange and he's in a wizard's dungeon. And he's looking around and he shrugs yeah, that's about Wizard's Dungeon would look like, which is hilarious and just so crazy to see Alfred Molina so many years later, that Doc Ock, back. It's just what a trip and what a treat, you know? And then, seeing Norman once again, like doing this battle with his inner demons in that alleyway, we sort of reprise that. I was like mind boggled to see, first of all, Peter's fighting Electro, and then Sandman shows up to help. Like, it's Christmas. What a Christmas gift.
It's just so much fun. I mean, and there's been such a trend of that in a lot of properties these days. There's reboots and there's reunion specials. There's definitely a demand out there, I think, for a lot of people. They love to revisit characters that they grew up with or that they just have grown to know and love, or are so passionate about. And I think this movie really, hit a home run when it came to that. It really brought back these Raimi characters with aplomb and with such skill. And it was just, like you said, such a treat. So exciting to see them again and see them kind of brought into the modern age too, because it's interesting. 2007, 2002 to 2007, it wasn't that long ago, but at the same time, it feels like such a long time ago. You watch the Raimi trilogy and you just see little differences there. There's no social media, no Facebook, no smartphones. I mean,
a lot of people using payphones.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how many times was that a plot point? It's just, it's always interesting to see characters from something, decades old, which, I guess the first Raimi movie will be 2 decades old in just a little bit of time here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's what I like too. It's like, you're seeing these characters, what's it like for them in the modern age? Just the things that are different about life now versus just even 15 years ago.
Well, and doing this gives us the opportunity to like put Otto Octavius and Norman Osborn in a room together.
Yeah.
And it's like, they would know each other. Yeah, they worked at Oscorp together. Of course they would know. And the fact that they both know a little bit of each other's histories, and Sandman knows they both died, just putting them all in a room and seeing them all interact, it's like, who would have ever thought we could have gotten something like that? Certainly not the actors. Like, the actors themselves, keep saying, like, I never thought something like this would happen. Willem Dafoe said, like, he kept saying, like, I thought it was crazy when they called me and told me the idea, but I was like, well, let's hear it out. And it's so meaningful, though. Like, they all have a really important purpose in the movie. They really aren't just there for fan service. I mean, there's fan service inherent in having them.
Yes,
but like the movie
yeah.
is sort of built around them. They're pivotal parts of the movie, which tells, I think, a really good story.
Yeah.
But, we're talking so much about the villains, too. We haven't even really touched on, like, when Ned opens that portal to Andrew and we saw him down the alleyway, I was like, oh, that's not Tom's suit. I know that. Those aren't Tom's eyes. And then he ran through and he jumped through the portal and took his mask off. And I was like a kid again. It was great.
Yeah.
There he is, Andrew Garfield.
Well, once he came back, we knew what was coming next. And for me, that was the biggest question. Would Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire be appearing in this movie? And yes, did they ever?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Peter, you and I were in that theater together, and yeah, we were both reacting the exact same way when we saw Andrew Garfield come out first, and then we finally get the man himself, Tobey Maguire.
Yeah, I mean, when Ned starts opening that next portal after Andrew, like, well, we know what's coming next,
Yep.
and there he was. All of a sudden, after all these years, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker up on screen again. And they're acting just like I remember them acting. They have, we have this nice, like, very delicate background James Horner Spider-Man theme for Andrew plays, and very delicate Danny Elfman theme for Spider-Man plays when Tobey's Peter shows up. And they're having all these interactions with each other. They're so funny. They're so emotional and heartwarming together. It's something I didn't think we would ever get. I hoped we would get, and we finally got it.
No, absolutely.
It's just beautiful seeing those two and also those 3 Spider-Mans all together.
Oh, I mean,
I'm just so glad they all decided to come back.
No, I am too. I mean, and I think the marketing department, they did a really good job of teasing it and hyping it up. I mean, that trailer really generated a lot of buzz and a lot of speculation about Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire. Would they ultimately be in the final product? And at least for me, I mean, I honestly didn't know 100% until I saw it on the screen myself.
Yeah, same.
And I think that was big part of why I mean, I would have seen the movie anyway, but
Oh, of course.
I mean, I still think though did a great job of generating a lot of hype. This will they or won't they be in the movie thing, and I would say one of the biggest surprises of that movie. It really, I know we're not a Mark Webb podcast here, but boy, this was by far my favorite time watching the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. I thought he was great in this movie. I really did.
Oh, he was so great. Yeah. He was so funny and then so tragic sometimes
Yeah, no,
too, you know?
I think they did a really great job with him in this movie. I really do. And as I said, it really made me appreciate his part of the Spider-Man cinematic multiverse. It made me appreciate that a little bit more.
Yeah. And again, I know we're not a web Spider-Man podcast, but they do form this sort of like brotherhood between the three of them. And I know Andrew Garfield has said like, well, and the writers have said too, like Andrew Garfield really wanted to play up that aspect that he was like the middle brother. He had like the middle brother syndrome.
Yeah.
You know, he always kind of felt left out. He didn't feel as cool as the other two. And that was an interesting dynamic to the character. I know Andrew Garfield said like he was just so floored by the concept of this. He had said like even just being on the screen with the two other Spider-Mans in cinema was enough for him, you know, as a fan. But he said just like, you know, when you think about it, just like the spiritual journey that would be to realize that like there's other people so close to me out there, not the same, but like in a brotherhood kind of way that they know what I've gone through and they can really empathize with that. Like you've spent your whole life alone. He said, you know, Spider-Man tends to be a very solitary character.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly getting to pull those people together and be like, you've got brothers. So and, you know, he said that really spoke to him and he really wanted to dive into that. And that comes from an interview with Variety. Incredible.
No, I absolutely. I was just thinking, just a comparison that I'm thinking about. One of my favorite topics. I was a history major, and I've always been fascinated by history, a history buff. And one of the things that I found interesting was that a lot of times they'll say, for the president of the United States, it's kind of a similar thing where like you form these relationships with your predecessors in office because they're the only ones that understand what it's like. They're the only ones that understand the pressure, the isolation that comes with the job, you know, and a lot of times you'll hear about presidents across party lines that form these friendships, like George W. Bush and Clinton, or Bush and Obama, or, you know, George W. Bush and Michelle Obama has been a bigger, you know, they seem to have formed a pretty good friendship in the last number of years. But I guess it's just interesting because it's like there are probably certain jobs where it's just nobody understands it unless they're also doing it or they've also done it. And I think a lot of times another similar group that I can think of is like war veterans. You know, you have veterans that go off to war, they're in combat, and it's really hard for them to come back and reintegrate into civilian life. Just, you know, most, you know, civilians, they don't understand. They don't know what it was like to be in the war zone. And you know, that's why they can relate much better in some cases to other veterans. You know, they'll join the VFW or other veterans groups just because they know what it's like. They can relate. They can understand in a way that other people can't. And so I think it was really cool for, you know, for all three of the Spider-Man in this movie to have that almost like a support group in a way. It's just these people where they know what it's like. They've all gone through similar tragedy, losing a family member in a very sad and just life-altering way. And they understand the burden, the weight of what being this hero means. So it's great for them to, I think, find that connection, because I think you can get support from like your friends or your significant other, but it's ultimately nothing's quite the same as, you know, commiserating with somebody who's been through it. It's just great that the three Spider-Man, they form that, again, that little support group, that bond, that triumvirate there, whatever you want to call it. I think that was a really cool thing to see. Yes, it's fun to see the three of them interact, but I think more significantly, it's cool to see them relate and just be able to understand and learn from each other how to cope with the job, or what does it mean to be Spider-Man, and I don't know, it's just cool to see them have that sort of experience together.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Sean. And I just want to say, like, even behind the scenes, you know, it's a very small club. You have people who have played Spider-Man in cinema. And I know Andrew Garfield has always talked about how he's looked up to Tobey in the role. You know, there's footage of him saying, like, to him, Tobey Maguire's always going to be Spider-Man. Like he, as a kid, like he memorized those lines, the opening monologue from the movie and everything. And in this interview with Variety, he was saying, behind the scenes, he said, I think the first time we were all in the suit together, it was hilarious because it's like just three ordinary dudes who were just actors, just hanging out. But then also, you just become a fan and you say, oh my God, we're all together in the suits and we're doing the pointing thing. There was talk about going to the bathroom and, padding around the package. We talked about what worked for each of us. Tom was jealous because I have little zippers in my suit that I can get my hands out very easily. To work his phone, he had to use his nose because he couldn't access his hands. And then we would have deeper conversations too and talk about our experiences with the character. Andrew also points out that there's a line I improvised in the movie when he looks at Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland and he says he loves them. He said that was just him loving them. That was his improvised line. He just loves those guys.
No, you could tell. You could tell they have some real chemistry on the screen together. They have a real... It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel fake at all.
Yeah. Wonderful to have our heroes back and have them all working together on the same side, building each other up, helping each other out. But you know what else was kind of wonderful in a different way? Norman Osborn himself. Huge part in this movie.
Yeah,
Definitely, I think culturally making a lot of waves with people. Sort of making the rounds once again with some brand new meme material. He comes back with a couple classic zingers, something of a scientist myself. Can the Spider-Man come out to play? And then he's got some modern classics now. Norman's on sabbatical, honey, is one that people love. And I can see why. But Gobby's back.
I know. It's just as we've been talking about how much fun it is to see the heroes back. It's fun to see the villains back too. What are they up to? How are they acting in the modern day?
And he's got a new look, for one thing, which I think is interesting. He keeps the flight suit, but now he's got this like tattered purple hood, and he's got some suit upgrades too. He's got a bag of tricks, those goggles, and he breaks the mask too, very early in No Way Home. So we get to see Norman's absolutely terrifying face that much more. In fact, the actors had said being on set with him, it was actually kind of terrifying. Because, he's given it his all. And when you're in that position, he's looking right at you. They say it's like hard not to feel actually afraid. They said like it was easy to like play into that performance because he was so scary on set.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we did get to see more of Willem Dafoe's face because that's so powerful and scary. But, in an interview with the New York Times, he says that probably was because of the negative backlash to the first one. The old Power Rangers suit, as we've discussed in the past, In the New York Times interview, he says, I must be honest, I am aware that there was some criticism of that mask in the original one. We heard it enough that it was probably a consideration to change it up a little bit. I don't think about that because I don't think about emoting with my face. My face follows my heart. It's just an expression of what you're feeling. So I think that's a good point, he would be doing that same thing with or without the mask, it sounds like. Yeah. And really, when you look very closely in Spider-Man 1 through the mask, you can just see how wild his eyes are, how, really mask-like his own face is under there, the expressions he's making. But it's nice to really get to remove that layer and just see the full terrifying force of the Goblin within.
Oh, absolutely.
So he's got some new tricks, and he's perfected some old tricks, too. He calls the glider once again to impale someone from behind. And this time it actually pretty much works out for him. So that's good for him. And also he was, again, as an actor, Willem Dafoe, very physical with his own stunts. And we've talked about that before on Spider-Man 1, that he always wanted to do everything he could with the character, with the stunts, even if it was just like his hand or an arm on the screen. He didn't want to double. He wanted to do it to give the Goblin his own character. That's very important to Willem Dafoe. He said that doing all that physical stuff was like very important to him signing on. That was sort of something he wanted to make sure he got to do before he took on the movie. He was saying to the New York Times, I said I really want there to be action. I want to take part in action scenes because that's really fun for me. It's the only way to root the character. Otherwise, it just becomes a series of memes. And he's probably got a good point there. And then, again, in a behind-the-scenes interview, he was saying, To do this physical stuff was important to me. And he goes on to say, because that's fun to me. And also, it's really impossible to add any integrity or any fun to the character if you don't participate in these things. Because all that action stuff informs your relationship to the characters in the story.
Yeah.
It makes you earn your right to play the character in a funny way.
Hmm.
I mean, I know there's been a lot of people saying like, wow, Willem Dafoe, 66 years old, out there kicking Tom Holland's butt with the best of them, probably is the best of them. And we said it before when we talked about the Green Goblin, but just so much respect to Willem Dafoe and his incredible commitment to this part.
Nobody else could do it. Nobody else could bring to that role what he brought to it.
I know one of the writers was saying in a different interview, when they had reached out and they said, hey, Willem Dafoe, would you be interested in this? And then like he got back to them and was saying like, yeah, would you be interested in like taking a walk with me so we can like really talk about how I see the character? And they're like, well, yeah, geez.
He's giving them notes.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate that in an actor being like, let's take a walk here. Let's talk about how I see the character. And that's what they had said. Eric Summers, the writer, was saying to the Hollywood Reporter that like no one knows the character as well as, or gives as much thought to the character as someone who then has to embody it and sell it.
Oh, yeah.
And, that definitely shaped what they did. They said, they were talking about Toby and Andrew's contribution as well as Willem Dafoe's contribution. I'm sure the others as well. But, like, what a conversation to be able to have with Willem Dafoe about the Green Goblin.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what's kind of funny is, in a previous episode, we've sort of said that the Green Goblin was essentially the overarching villain of the entire Sam Raimi Spider-Man franchise. And now, here, his villainy extends even beyond that original franchise. He's become Tom Holland's Peter Parker's most difficult, most destructive, most devastating foe he's ever faced on such a personal level as this. Like, he's not going to snap out half the universe, but like on a personal level.
I was going to say, and that's saying something given that, in the Tom Holland, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that Spider-Man was snapped out of existence. I mean, villains don't get much more, they don't take on a much bigger scope than that, wiping out half of existence.
Right.
So yeah, that's saying something if Norman Osborn manages to get under someone's skin even more than, Thanos.
Well, I think Jamie Foxx had a really interesting insight. CCXP convention had a villains panel with those three villains, Willem Dafoe, Alfred Molina, and Jamie Foxx. And they were asking who the most terrifying of the villains Peter was facing was. And I thought he had a really good observation where he says, like, look at Electro. Like, Electro is mad at the world. But he said, like, what Willem Dafoe does with this Peter Parker, he said it's personal. And he says nothing can beat that. Like, no matter what costume you put on, no matter what you say, when it's personal, that has the most weight. Nothing can beat that. And I think he's got a really good point. Like, Thanos, terrifying villain, but the Green Goblin, he's taken everything from Peter in the end.
It's just interesting at the end of the day that Thanos and Green Goblin, Norman Osborn are now all part of the same continuity in a way.
Yeah.
What a conversation we're having, I guess, is the point.
And I thought Endgame was mind-blowing with time travel and talking raccoons and everything coming together with Tony Stark and everything. And then here we have this spanning entire generations of Spider-Man franchises. Absolutely wild.
Well, and I think now we're kind of coming to, we've been talking a lot about the Green Goblin here and how he appears in this movie. And I think we can really start to look in more detail at what I think is what are a couple of the biggest questions that have arisen as a result of his most recent portrayal here in No Way Home. What is Norman's relationship with the Goblin in this film? And what is this film's interpretation of that Norman/Goblin relationship? And that's something, Peter, you and I have discussed quite extensively already. Where does Norman end? Where does the Goblin begin? Are they one and the same? Are they different? Is one, just amplifying the other? Is it a split personality? Is it an alter ego? Is it the same person the whole time, just maybe under some sort of, like you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol or something that's, intensifying feelings that might have already been there, but you lose that inhibition? I don't know. I mean, that's or mind-altering substances. I mean, I guess we talked a lot about that in our earlier episodes here. And I think that's one of the biggest things that this movie dives into with the Green Goblin here and Norman Osborn, which is what is the structure of their relationship to one another?
Yeah, and I know in the first movie, I think it's sort of intentionally a little bit vague, a little bit open to interpretation, which I love.
Yeah.
And of course, there's different ways to interpret it here too. But one of the interpretations that we enjoyed going through last time was that, like, essentially the qualities that form the Green Goblin were already in Norman. They were sort of like his id versus his ego. The id in there, the darker parts of his personality that he didn't necessarily want to admit to. They didn't necessarily want to acknowledge. But those parts were given a voice by the Goblin and, like, brought to the surface. And so it all is sort of an extension of him, and he's able to have this sort of like conversation with the darker side of himself.
To say what you won't, to do what you can't.
Precisely. Well, because, like, you know, already in that movie, like, everything that the Goblin did was essentially something that on some level Norman wanted to be done. So they're working sort of in tandem a lot, even though, again, these are the parts of Norman that sort of frighten him. Gradually throughout the movie, I think he sort of comes to connect with it closer and closer, sort of sublimating it more and more into his ego even. But here, in this movie, you know, we're sort of thrown right back into this fight between Norman and the Goblin. The Goblin seems now to, like, completely supplant the Norman identity, totally against Norman's will this time. Like I said before, there always seemed to be something that Norman was getting out of it as well. And also, like, for him just to emerge like this, I don't think we've really seen it. Like, maybe it could have come close in, like, the Thanksgiving dinner or at the board meeting, we start seeing hints of the Goblin. But for the Goblin just to, like, suddenly be there and just overtake Norman.
Yeah, you definitely see Norman. I mean, at one point he's begging, he's pleading for help. He's
in those just throes of despair and anguish, like we, you know, had previously seen him when he's, like, on the floor with the mask on his chair.
You know, he just seems so terrified of the Goblin, and he wants to get away from him. You know, you feel bad for him. You feel bad for the guy. You know, when he goes to Aunt May, he wants help. You feel bad seeing him so scared and just not knowing what to do. And just on a side note, I mean, just imagine what it would be like to wake up and you're in this completely different world, this alternate universe where, I mean, I think anybody would be terrified if they woke up in that circumstance, which is you wake up in this world and, you know, your son doesn't exist, your like Oscorp doesn't exist. That whole, just none of that exists. You don't exist. Nobody knows who you are. And I think that would be just so terrifying. It would be so hard to deal with that by itself for anybody, let alone somebody who has this struggle in his soul over what kind of person is he going to be.
Yeah. And at one point, you know, Doc Ock says, you're flying off into the darkness to fight a ghost. Norman Osborn is dead, you know, and in some ways he is. Norman shows up here and, you know, that total lack of connection terrifies him, but it seems to embolden the Goblin. And I think that's a huge catalyst to both Norman and the Goblin in this movie. Like, arriving in this new world, like you said, losing his family, his company, his house, his own identity. I think that's such like a huge splash of cold water to Norman's face. I think it sort of like helps wake him up from that stupor of the Goblin and sort of re-examine his life and his connection to the Goblin. You know, I think he's so thoroughly system shocked, you know, that he ends up turning to Spider-Man for help, like the one person he thinks he can help him. He's more humbled and more, like, human than we've really ever seen Norman before, I think.
Yeah.
It's in some ways almost like an interesting parallel to where Tom Holland's Peter ends up at the end of the movie, totally disconnected, you know, in terms of his identity from everyone.
I was just about to say that because, yeah, you see Norman and how he reacts to being totally anonymous. Nobody knows him. He's a nobody in this universe.
It's terrifying.
And by the end of the movie, Tom Holland's Spider-Man is kind of in the same boat. Doesn't have anybody.
Interesting parallel to the choice Peter ends up making later to willingly let go of all of that connection and identity. And yet, I think his darker half also has, like, some sort of a reaction to that. I think, like, the Goblin suddenly finds itself in a new world, as the Goblin says, like a new world to conquer. He's not tethered to a pre-existing reality of Norman. Well, you know, he finds himself surrounded by villains and people who already know his identity. So, like, there's nothing of the Norman identity to ground him. There's really nothing holding him back.
Yeah, there's no Oscorp board that just fired them. There's no Quest Aerospace trying to, you know, home in on their military contract game. There's none of these rivals that have messed with them or wronged them or slighted them in some way.
Right. So he just has the world now to mess
Yeah,
with.
it's just kind of evil for evil's sake, cruelty for cruelty's sake almost.
And one question I have is like, how long was the Goblin there? Like, how long was the Goblin waiting to strike?
That's a good question.
Because I know watching the movie the first time, I kept wondering, like, is this a trick? Is the Goblin going to snap? When's it going to happen? And, the Goblin later says that he was watching at Aunt May's work. So the Goblin was there deep behind Norman's eye. So Norman was definitely in control, the Goblin says, at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I do notice that Norman is wearing his Goblin flight suit the whole time, even under those clothes that he found. So I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting that, like, he never actually let go of that. And he was always sort of lurking just under the surface. Maybe unbeknownst to Norman even. Maybe Norman didn't even realize that he was putting on clothes over the flight suit. I don't know. But again, in this movie, just like they did in the Spider-Man movie, Willem Dafoe wears nice-looking false teeth when he's in his Norman persona, and then they let him use his natural teeth, which aren't as like uniform when he's the Goblin. But again, I really can't tell from just that personally.
Yeah.
One other question I had is like, I wonder if the Goblin like purposely fudged that formula that Norman was working on to help cure himself of that persona. Because Aunt May does end up jabbing him in the neck with it, and he says it didn't work. But I have to wonder, because in that scene where we see him messing with the formula, Otto's telling him how great it's going to be when there's no more darker half, just you. And like you just see the back of Norman's head, and he very forebodingly says, just me.
Yeah, I think there was something was going on there. I don't think
so. He probably purposely was sabotaging the formula. At least that's my interpretation of that.
Yeah, I think so. It was just Goblin. There wasn't really much of Norman there anymore at that point.
No, but so then that leaves him, like we said, with this whole world to conquer, and he sort of picks Peter as his first target. In part, I think, sort of because he was slighted by Peter in a sense. We know the Goblin is very vindictive, and
oh yes,
he does say, you tried to fix me, now I'm going to fix you. And so he sort of takes it upon himself to become like this dark mentor to Peter. Similar to that, in Spider-Man 1, Peter's caught in this sort of moral battle between these two competing father figures, Uncle Ben on one side, and Norman / the Goblin on the other side. The bad side.
Kind of like the old trope of, you have an angel on one shoulder, a devil on the other.
Absolutely. And so once again, we sort of see Norman and the Goblin return to that formula. Heck, once again, Norman is so thoroughly impressed with Peter's intelligence and scientific skills that he, humorously suggests he'd be happy to hire Peter at Oscorp if he didn't mind commuting to another universe. Once again, offers him a job because he's impressed with his mental power. But of course, the Goblin has a totally different take on all this. And I think, too, we've talked about how the villains and the characters in this world returning from other franchises all fit really well in this movie and serve important functions. I think one of the ways that Norman works so well and resonates in this trilogy is that I think this Homecoming trilogy focuses a lot on themes of legacy and mentorship. Because Peter's always surrounded by these potential mentors and parental figures throughout it, like Tony Stark, Aunt May, Nick Fury, Quentin Beck.
And I would just say, like, even more indirectly, but still in this universe, I mean, you have figures like Captain America, you have all the other Avengers that presumably would have been at least, maybe not directly mentoring him, but at least some sort of influence on how he should behave, people that he can look up to and somewhat relate to as enhanced individuals. So I think the Tom Holland movies definitely focus on that.
And in this one in particular, there's just like a bevy of characters surrounding Peter on this moral journey. We have Aunt May, obviously. We've got several older brothers, stepping up. Doctor Strange is sort of like in the middle here. He has his own sort of philosophy that he tries to instill on Peter. And then, Green Goblin is on that far side that we don't want to see Peter go down. And he makes it his mission to drag Peter over to that side. He tells him, you can have anything you want. You can do whatever you want. There's no rules. Meanwhile, Doctor Strange is telling him, no, there are rules, and you can't do whatever you want. The problem, he says, is you're trying to live these two different lives. You have to pick one. You have to choose. But at the same time, he tells him, like, well, these villains, they're not your problem. They're fated to die, so be it. it's not up to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then meanwhile, on the far other side, there's Aunt May, who says, yes, there's rules. Furthermore, there are obligations and responsibility. And you have to do this because you can. These villains are, in fact, your problem because you have the power to help them, so you have to. It's like Willem Dafoe says, he said during the CCXP convention, Green Goblin has a case to state this time. He's trying to make a case, a philosophy of life. It's not about some kind of abstract mustache twirling power grab. And he sort of elaborates that on a behind-the-scenes interview where he says that the Goblin character really believes in a world of losers and winners, and he believes that power is all that matters. And it's not an abstract thing, philosophically. He has very little patience or interest in compassion or empathy. He believes things get done by people that are strong. And weak people, we don't really worry about them. And that all feels very consistent with where he is in Spider-Man 1.
Oh, absolutely. We talked quite a bit about that in those episodes, how he feels about the teeming masses.
Yeah.
They're only good for one thing.
And lifting up the exceptional few. And we talked in our episodes about, Norman basically seeing himself as a god. And, that moment where he confronts God himself by challenging Aunt May to finish the Lord's Prayer. And he makes that explicit in this one, where he says, gods don't have to choose, we take. And so throughout this movie, the Goblin is hell-bent on carrying out this deep philosophical discussion with Peter with his fists. There's this whole war of the gods to prove the Goblin's physical power and his intellectual enlightenment. His complete supremacy over Peter and May and their apparently faulty ways of thinking. He's just thrilled to show Peter that he can have so much more and do whatever he wants as soon as he lets go of his morality.
That reminds me of, oddly enough, an episode of The Big Bang Theory that I watched many years ago, but I just remember there was a line, Sheldon, the resident know-it-all, he quotes Friedrich Nietzsche, which is something to the effect of, morality is just something that lesser people invented to hold the truly exceptional ones back.
Wow.
Like I said, oddly enough, it was from Big Bang Theory, but it sounds exactly like the point that Norman is trying to get here, that, just let go of morality. It's not really doing anything for you. It was invented by lesser people just to hold us gods, us exceptional people back and, to keep us from our true potential. So it's not serving you any good.
Yeah, and he really wants Peter to see that. And Goblin wants to make it so clear to Peter. He wants him to lose everything to prove that, he's trying to help people. But as he says, no good deed goes unpunished, which I have to say sounds an awful lot like, in spite of everything you've done for them, eventually they will hate you.
Yep.
And maybe not too dissimilar to the end of Spider-Man 1, where he wants to teach Peter a lesson by attacking his heart. But even more so here. He wants to thoroughly see his soul turn sour. More than just making him suffer and kill him. He wants his soul to wither and become as dark as his. And one of the especially dangerous things about the Goblin this time around that I don't really quite think Tobey's Peter had to face was that even in the act of fighting him, certainly in the act of wanting to kill him, he's winning. The Goblin is winning. That's him seducing you to his side. You can see just how gleeful. He's just smiling downright gleefully whenever Peter's anger and rage leads him to beat the daylights out of him.
It's a very, very similar dynamic to Return of the Jedi. When
I was so sure you were going to say that.
Because
we love to compare. Yeah, we love to compare the Goblin Spider-Man storyline to Star Wars.
Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, and the Emperor there. I mean, but I think there are a lot of very obvious similarities. But I think it's interesting.
Exactly.
It's obviously a very compelling kind of story arc. But I think in terms of the plot points, I think there's a lot of similarity and parallel to that very famous climactic scene from Return of the Jedi to what we saw here in No Way Home, which is this, the villain almost, they're daring the hero to embrace the dark side, to embrace the hatred, embrace the anger.
Right, because that's so easy. We're trained to be fight the bad guy. But, here, as you're doing it, as you're letting your hate spill over, you're letting them win. You're renouncing your rules and your limitations, and you are wanting to take what you want, which in this case is the Goblin's destruction. And so, he smiles gleefully, much like Palpatine once smiled gleefully to see the hero come so close to succumbing into the darkness like that?
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole big moral conflict, the whole moral battleground once again between the Goblin's philosophies and Aunt May's philosophies in this case. She tells him, with great power there must also come great responsibility. If you can help people, you have to. This is what we do. Or as her gravestone says, when you help someone, you help everyone, which I believe was borrowed from the 2018 Insomniac game, where that was also Aunt May's philosophy.
That game, I played it last year. Last year, 2021.
Did you recognize that in the movie? Because I didn't know at the time. I looked it up later. Because
I recognized that because I was like, that's very familiar. And then it hit me like, oh, that's from the Aunt May from the video game.
I thought that was cool to sort of bring in that Aunt May lore, which apparently was invented for that video game. And not to mention, like, she's working for the same company too, the Feast. It's the same organization that she's working for in the video game as well.
Well, that was that was what tipped me off, because I'm like, oh, Feast. That was a huge plot point in the video game.
Mm-hmm.
Great, fantastic video game. So it was really cool to see, as cool as it was to see the Raimi movies put into this No Way Home. It was also really cool to see them bring in some elements from the video game continuity as well. So that was, really neat to see that.
Really cool to see that worked in. Yeah.
Well, Peter, we've been talking a lot just now about Feast.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little hungry here.
Oh?
I think I am ready to have you chow down on my question for you.
Ah.
I think it's time for you and I to challenge each other to another round of Brilliant or Lazy.
I thought it was going to be pizza time.
Yeah,
it's Brilliant or Lazy time.
Well, I am ready for you to chow down on my question. I can't wait to see which one of us will be eating their words.
Good one.
I will offer you the chance to ask your question first, because otherwise I'm ready to go. I really want to see if you can get my question.
Well, you're too kind, Sean. You're certainly too kind. I'll take you up on your offer. And we've been talking a lot about Norman, the Green Goblin, this episode. And also speaking of your food transition, your clever food transition there,
mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can combine the two and ask you, how many donuts do we see Norman Osborn secretly stow away for later while at the Feast Center?
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I think they were donuts. He took some sort of from a
breakfast
box.
Pastry. I'm going to guess 3. I don't know. I don't think it's a homeless shelter. It's a place for the less fortunate. And so I don't think at that point in the movie he wasn't. I think he had enough goodwill in him to not take pastries from those who really needed them. So I'm going to guess 3.
He was being pretty sneaky, though.
True.
Yeah, good.
3.
Good guess. Yeah, I was kind of thinking 3, too. 3 sounds about right, but in fact, it was 2 that we see. 1 for each pocket, either side of his jacket.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Practical Norman.
Exactly. He takes a moment while Aunt May and Peter are talking to, sneakily, slide the box closer to him. And he takes one, and he takes another.
I mean, that is very, very astute viewing there. I didn't even notice that.
He's probably going to need a snack later. Got to keep an eye on his blood sugar, I'm sure.
I mean,
and it's just practical.
Well, I guess
he sees something and he's going to take it. We know Norman, gods don't have to choose, they take. So I'm going to take this donut. He's never asked before for food. I mean, Aunt May can tell you that.
That's
when he's
true.
hungry, he's just going to take it.
We're not used to seeing Norman in that kind of position where he literally is dependent on the charity of others. It's very unusual to see somebody who
is very humbling.
In his own timeline, he's heading this major defense contractor, very wealthy, lives in a mansion with servants and all of that stuff. And then in this movie, somebody, living basically on the streets, nowhere to go, no food, not a penny to his name. It's very sad.
No, yeah, it is very humbling and humiliating. And it makes sense to sort of grab some food just in case, he doesn't know what's going to happen later.
Yeah,
so just to be ready. But of course, it's interesting that he grabs the donuts specifically. I think there's some better food
was there,
hanging around in the kitchen there.
Was there some healthier food, bananas or oranges or grapefruit, any sort of healthier breakfast fare?
Yeah, for what it's worth. I mean, there are some little salads put together already that we can see in the kitchen. But then again, who wants a salad,
Well, I have to question his taste in sweets based on at least the fruitcake. Fruitcakes are just
That's a good point.
horrid things. But then again, I've never met a person who didn't like at least some kind of donut. They're just a universally beloved thing. I mean, just like the Krabby Patty. The only people who don't like donuts have never tasted one.
Exactly.
But anyway, so before we get too far
All
into
right, Sean. So you're sort of dodging the verdict, which is not exactly brilliant.
but
I'm sorry.
well, I think we had in one of our other episodes there was a question I got sort of right. So I think I was half brilliant, half lazy, so average. But if we want to put a darker spin on it, we could say mediocre. Mediocre?
Mediocre? I'm sorry, Sean. You missed brilliant by exactly one donut. I'm sorry. You're one donut below brilliant. Sorry.
So, well, that's okay. So, we've been talking a lot about feast here.
Mm-hmm.
And it is time for you to feast on my question.
Let's do it.
So, feast, as you may have noticed in the movie, is an acronym.
Yeah. Oh.
What does it stand for?
Ooh. Okay. Well, so I think I should say, for the record, I have no idea. So let me try to parse that here. For everyone, always some tasty -food.
Could you say that again?
I think it's for everyone, always some tasty -food. So for everyone, always some tasty food. Tasty food, all one word.
I like that. I like that guess, but unfortunately, it is incorrect.
Okay. So what does feast really stand for?
It stands for food, emergency, aid, shelter, training.
Okay. Well, that's good. That sounds better than what I came up with.
So kind of a one-stop shop for a lot of different sorts of social services if you're unfortunately in that position in that part of New York City. So
yeah, well, that is a really great way to see Aunt May really practicing what she preaches for Peter.
Yeah,
and that's really nice to have that as sort of a centerpiece of this movie, and really cool on us for managing to sort of like sort of accidentally make all of our questions so thematically resonant. So we done good.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed this dinner of failures, I guess, because I'm lazy and you're lazy.
Yeah,
not exactly a breakfast of champions, more of a brunch of losers.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've pretty much run our food and feasting segues pretty much as far as they can go.
Well, I think there is a fork. There is a fork in the road here, Peter. We can either continue to make food jokes, or we can, get back to the meat of this episode.
I'm gonna put a stop to this. I'm gonna put an end to this right now.
Put an end to the madness.
Well, at the risk of getting any more poorly constructed food jokes or segues, we are getting toward the end of this episode now, so I'm going to move us along.
All right.
Before we finish this episode, I would like to sneak in a discussion about another returning Raimi rapscallion, our man Flint Marko. But before that, I've got a last lingering question about the legacy of the Green Goblin in the Raimiverse. And Sean, you know what that question is.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think we've talked about this in other episodes, but
Right.
It's just the Green Goblin's attack on the Unity Festival gets front page coverage in the Bugle. So you have to imagine that when Norman Osborn dies, or when this battle with the Green Goblin at the bridge there, that's got to be front page news.
Which we sort of wondered about, like, isn't it sort of a coincidence that, as soon as this high profile person dies, all these goblin attacks stopped as well?
Yeah. At some point, somebody connected the dots that Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin.
Yeah.
And I think that raises the question then of, in the Raimi universe, when did it become apparent to people like Dr. Octopus about Norman and the Goblin and that whole thing? When did the wider public become privy to that knowledge?
Well, I thought that was something that was interesting because, yeah, that is crazy to think. Even by the time of Spider-Man 2, Doc Ock already knows that Norman was the Green Goblin. So, like, really not that long. Within 2 years, people had connected the dots. Because this movie makes it clear that apparently Otto and Flint are both very aware that Norman Osborn was in fact the Green Goblin and did in fact kill himself, which in the Raimi movies is not clear. All we see from what Harry's looking up is that the police are suspecting Spider-Man to have been the killer of Norman Osborn. But then again, I suppose you have to say, well, I guess that's just Harry's bias at play here. Just assuming that, well, obviously my dad couldn't have been the Green Goblin. Spider-Man must have killed him. So maybe that's why we never hear about it. And I suppose you have to assume Otto wouldn't bring it up because, that's a little off color to bring up with the son of the man in question.
And also
who also happens to be your boss. Yeah.
And, the guy that's giving you tons of money to build your machine. So, a little
Happy
bit of
to pay the bills.
Yeah, I I wouldn't want to say or do anything to offend him.
I'm sure, they couldn't really prove anything either way. But at the same time, I wonder if Otto was, also passingly aware of that glider, at least in passing, that he could sort of put two and two together to be like, okay, yeah, so like Osborne's dead, the attacks have stopped, they think that there's a connection. I think so too, because that's definitely the Oscorp glider.
That is a great example of what, as a lawyer, what we would call circumstantial evidence. It's just inferences, but they make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. It's like, you're kind of looking for these connections between things. And likewise, I'm sure, they probably figured it out that, he was the one that stole the flight suit from the factory. He stole the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And not to mention the murder of the board members, somebody would have figured out that very soon before that was when they fired Norman from the company, and Norman had this big outburst at the meeting. I'm sure people would have figured that out, put two and two together, seen the glider wounds on his body. I feel like it would have become pretty apparent pretty quickly that Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin. He was the guy that bombed Times Square, the guy that kidnapped Mary Jane and Aunt May, the guy that almost killed the kids on the tram car. Or the cable car, I should say.
And, as Flint says, it was all over the news. And we don't really see that. But then again, I guess you have to figure our main source of news as observers of the Raimi franchise is the Daily Bugle, which is hell-bent on saying that Spider-Man was behind everything. Well, so again, the bias.
Not to mention that, Jameson's one assistant in the Raimi movies. He makes a comment about how the Daily Bugle is what, like 9th or 10th in circulation?
That's a good point too. Yeah.
So there's clearly not just one or two, but at least 6 or 7 other newspapers in New York City that are presumably covering these same events. And I mean, a company like Oscorp, where Norman Osborn was a very, well-known, member of the community. His company was, the largest supplier to the U.S. military. I mean, in our world, obviously, most people would know that, say, Boeing or Halliburton or military contractors are very well-known companies is what I'm trying to say. And I think the death of the CEO of one of those companies under very suspicious circumstances would have definitely gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah. And apparently now we have confirmation that it did, thanks to Flint. And speaking of Flint, we get to pick up again with Flint Marko in the movie when he meets up with Peter.
Of the 3 Raimi villains that they bring back, he's the one that gets by far the least amount of development, the least amount of screen time.
It's true.
We don't get to know as much about his goings on and what he's been up to.
Not really, no.
We don't get to get as much of a peek into him.
What's interesting is I think we can sort of assume that he comes from a fairly later point in his timeline, rather than most of the villains who come very shortly before they were killed in their battle with Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Flint gets away to live hopefully a happy life.
He's forgiven for his involvement in the death of Uncle Ben.
Yeah.
And he just kind of floats away on the wind.
Yeah. And when he first sees Peter, he recognizes the costume and says, remember me? Sort of suggesting that there's been a passage of time here. So he certainly wasn't plucked from, the midst of the final confrontation in Spider-Man 3. It could have been a very long time.
It could have been. Yeah. It's a little bit more ambiguous.
Which, for me, suggests a couple of things. First of all, Penny is doing all right, which is good.
Yeah.
Her medical condition in Spider-Man 3 is a little unclear how she was doing. So that's, sort of good to check in that front. And then also, I guess it sort of suggests that either Flint's been keeping his nose clean enough to avoid a run-in with Spider-Man since, or they've got some sort of a understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But so they've definitely not run into each other since.
Yeah.
And I think he's very interesting in this movie. He's pretty chill most of the time. And even though he's deeply confused when he first finds himself here, he doesn't know where this is. He doesn't know what's going on. There's monsters around. But his first instinct is to help Peter. He sort of recognized that costume, says, hey, what can I do to help? So from the jump, that's a good guy. It's a well-intentioned guy. But then it's not until things get like increasingly weird, that his more cautious and untrusting instincts sort of start to emerge. As Electro asks him, you trust Peter? He's like, I don't trust anyone. He wants to go along with Peter. He wants to help Peter, as soon as the villains are cured, the sooner he gets to go home to Penny, he says. And, so, he takes on himself to tolerate quite a while of waiting quietly and respectfully as Peter sorts this stuff out with the villains. It's not until things like start going sideways that he like retreats to himself, with that single-minded goal of getting back to his daughter. But like, I think that like that lack of trust, I think that sort of sounds about right for Flint.
Yeah. That comports with everything we've already learned about him from Spider-Man 3. Seems like a solitary guy, doesn't always work well with others.
No.
I mean, he seems like he's been burned by a lot of different people. He clearly has a very tense relationship with Penny's mother.
Mm-hmm.
That can't help anything. That can't help you with being able to trust people, I imagine. So
yeah, and think about the last partnership he apparently formed, with Dennis Carradine. Definitely
did not
turn
end
out
well.
very well. So
yeah.
So he does sort of seem like this person who'd rather leave well enough alone, just in general.
Well, even just another, it's a very quick scene in Spider-Man 3, but you remember there's that scene where he's fighting Venom at one point because I think he thinks that Venom is Spider-Man or
right.
But yeah, even in that movie, it takes a little bit of persuasion from Eddie Brock Venom to convince Sandman to join in his conspiracy to finally kill Spider-Man. So
right. So I mean, I think what we see there is like, first off, he's like, I'm not going to deal with this weird thing. I'm just going to walk away. I think that speaks a lot to the character. I'm just caring about me, caring about my daughter. Don't need to worry about anything else. And like you said, it sort of takes a little bit of a discussion. And I think what we see there is like there is a little bit of an opportunistic edge to him. Like he does sort of end up making decisions. Not necessarily like the best decisions, the wisest decisions sometimes, but like sometimes if he's like, okay, well, there's an opportunity to get Spider-Man finally off my back, I guess I'll take it because he's keeping me from helping my daughter.
yeah.
And so I think that sort of lines up what we see here. It's maybe not the best choice to like end up opposing Peter and the other Spider-Mans as they're trying to get everyone back to their world, but he can't trust them. He can't even trust their abilities, that they'll be able to defeat these other villains.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the final fight, you see him fighting Electro as well as the other guys. Like he just wants to go home. He's had enough. He's tired. He doesn't want to risk Electro or one of the other villains destroying that box and trapping him here forever. So it's sort of tragic in that way that his, how solitary he is. He's this very untrusting, salt of the earth, small time crook.
Yeah.
Who just kind of keeps getting like jerked around by this very strange world.
Keeps getting caught up in things that are just so far beyond whatever he intended to be involved in. He just keeps getting caught up in these crazy scenarios. You're right. He's just a small time crook who just wants to, get money to take care of his daughter and her health issues. It doesn't seem like he's looking for bigger trouble than that. And
no,
he keeps finding himself in the middle of trouble like that. And,
yeah. Right.
That has to be
not
very
a bad person. Just has bad luck.
Kind of similar to like, Norman. So even in his own universe, he already feels this way, very solitary, disconnected, very just not looking to make a lot of waves. But then you take all of that and you transplant him into this other universe where he's even more disoriented, even more disconnected, even more doesn't know what the heck is going on, doesn't know what's what, doesn't know what is real, what's not. So, like we were talking about with Norman, like just imagine if you were transplanted into a universe where you knew nothing, knew nobody. It would be very hard to trust people. You wouldn't know anything. You wouldn't have any reason to trust people. You wouldn't have anything to base anything on.
True.
It'd be so hard to function in that situation. It really would.
So that catalyst of being in this new world is also very interesting to see how he as a character reacts to it. It is sort of tragic in a way, because he is, his trust is very hard won, but yeah, he just doesn't have the faith that Spider-Man or even Spider-Man and the other Spider-Mans are going to be able to have the chance to get that box back. And so instead of risking it, he puts it all in on himself as the loner that he is. That he's the only one he can trust. Someone who feels more comfortable handling things on their own because they don't trust others to do it well or to be able to get along with them. And I wonder if that's part of why, he keeps finding himself having such bad luck, because he does not get along with people and he does try to stay away from people and he keeps getting into trouble, and there's not necessarily someone to help him, and maybe it's sort of like this like vicious cycle. And we
Yeah.
sort of see that tragically in this movie, that he ends up going his own way instead of getting assistance like Tom Holland's Spider-Man does from a myriad of people.
Yeah.
But he's scared and trapped and desperate, and then he ends up being, sort of forcibly losing his powers before being sent home. It's sort of a sad arc for him.
I think a lot of his life is very sad. Just
Yeah.
from what we've seen, again, what we know of him already before this movie, it's just very sad. A sick daughter, a failed marriage, in and out of prison, this unintentional death of Uncle Ben on your hands.
Yeah.
He's just a very tragic character. He always has been. And I think this movie definitely reinforces and builds on that. It's very sad. But I will say, I do think he gets a few lighter moments in the movie as well. That I think he does play a little bit of comedic relief. I know he and Electro for a while have sort of a little bit of a banter going. That's kind of interesting to watch.
I do love the moment where he goes in, sits down on the couch, gets sand on the couch.
That's what I mean.
He's like, oh, sorry. Tries to brush it off, but he's sand. There's just more sand.
Yes, because sand, as we're well aware from another Star Wars connection there, we're all aware of Anakin's feelings on sand from Attack of the Clones. So it's just...
It gets everywhere. Who can blame
So yeah,
him?
I mean, yes, I think overall Sandman, his trajectory is tragic and very sad, but they do give him a few moments to shine. They give him a few comedic moments. They give him how he interacts with some of these other characters from the different universes. So it's interesting.
Yeah. He's just a big guy who just happens to be coarse and rough and irritating, and he gets everywhere. But, well, that's sort of brings us to another point here, that he's always sand in this movie, which is very interesting. And on the one hand, apparently Thomas Hayden Church wasn't on set for this film. He seems unable to been able to take part physically for whatever reason. But obviously there must be some sort of a story reason too, because it's a story and he's sand the whole time.
Yeah.
I know for me, I sort of think of him like maybe being sand is sort of an expression of him always being on guard.
That's what I was about. I think it's a defense mechanism almost. He knows that when he's sand, he's a lot more formidable. He's a lot tougher. It's a way to toughen himself up. Like different animals, they have their techniques of the peacock spreads its feathers, or, getting on your hind legs if you're a bear. He turns into sand. That's his way of posturing and saying,
I think so.
Don't mess with me.
Yeah, I think so. Because, at the same time, he's stronger and at the same time, untouchable. There's a moment where Peter tries to sort of high five him when he's sand, and his hand just kind of whoop, just kind of dissipates. So yeah, I think that's a way to at least I interpret that as a expression of his distrust and always sort of being on edge, always sort of being cautious, showing that, hey, don't forget, I'm made of sand.
Well, like we just said, sand, and also too, just his personality more generally, coarse, irritating.
Well, true. Yeah.
Just prickly. Sand is very jagged.
Yeah, he reflects all that. Yeah.
Well, for Flint Marco, life is a beach, let's say. But I hope you and I are as tough as Flint Marco, because we'll have to play We Are Who We Choose to Be.
All right, here we go. A new world to conquer. The Goblin's favorite game has made it into this universe as well.
Well, Peter, since you took the first question in the last game, I think I'll lead off our discussion this time around for this wonderful game full of sadistic choices.
Take it away.
So, okay.
Uh-oh.
Some of my questions in the past have focused a little bit on what kind of job would you want to have in the workplace? I think I asked you last time if you would want to be in the Oscorp HR department after Norman's, let's call them outbursts. So my question this time around is kind of similar to that.
Okay.
It's comparing the Raimi verse with the Tom Holland verse, for lack of a better name. So, would you rather work as an assistant for J. Jonah Jameson at the Daily Bugle newspaper in the Raimi universe, or for his podcast / internet show, or whatever type of venture this is in the Tom Holland movies? Based on what we've seen of Mr. Jameson in both settings, which one of him would you rather have as the boss? Which one seems like the better boss to work for, I guess?
Man, that's a good question.
Or I guess which one is the worst? Which one?
The lesser of two Jamesons, yeah. Yeah, because we really haven't talked about Triple J too much. I mean, certainly he's quite the sourpuss in both worlds. Prickly, as ever. Man, something about him seems somehow kind of even smarmier in the Watt world
Yeah.
rather than the Raimi verse. Like we haven't really yet gotten a moment where like he protects a photographer, for instance, or like realizes that he's printed something that's definitely untrue, so he has to
Printer.
retract it.
Yeah.
Right. So like we haven't really had a moment like that yet to really show there's some sort of moral core to this one.
Yeah. In the Raimi verse, he's definitely abrasive, rude, short tempered, but there is like there's like an honor, there's an honorability, there's a code of journalistic ethics that he really strongly adheres to, even if his newspaper is a bit on the sensationalist side.
Yeah.
He does seem like overall a relatively honest editor, an honest businessman. He's just, short tempered, kind of. I think he's exasperated by the kind of people that work there.
Yeah.
Plus, his wife is constantly calling in, reminding him to take his medication, his anti-stress medication, which is having the opposite effect, as we've seen. So,
Yeah, he definitely needs to see his doctor. He needs to get his doses checked.
well, the only professional that we know he trusts is his barber. So
And I was gonna say, in the MCU world, he doesn't even trust his barber. So doesn't trust anyone in the MCU world.
So yeah, he seems a lot even more unhinged in the MCU. Plus, it's just different. I mean, the rules are different. I feel like with the old school newspaper world, I mean, there's a little bit more of this gentlemanly way of doing things versus in the more cutthroat internet podcasting sort of world. There's just a lot less rules about how to be a professional in that setting. So
now, I mean, for what it's worth, I know that J.K. Simmons has said that like he's aware that the filmmakers probably treat them as like very different characters, but as far as he's concerned, he's just playing the same character. He's playing it the same way as he would before.
Yeah.
It's just that he's running like a big media conglomerate instead of a newspaper. But yeah, there does just seem to be something. Well, we've seen more of JJJ in the originals, so
yeah.
I've seen a little bit more of that personality where I think I'd rather work there. I don't know. And there's something about maybe like the feel of a newspaper room too, a newspaper office rather than his set or
his like basement studio or whatever, wherever he's broadcasting from.
But man, he really had quite the upgrade. Like he really benefited from that whole Spider-Man publicity. I mean, he got a helicopter.
Yeah,
he went from having like a basement studio to like getting a helicopter.
I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, he had no hesitation about telling everybody about the real identity of Spider-Man in the MCU movies. He had no hesitation to put a very young 16-year-old or 17-year-old at risk, a high schooler.
Yeah.
He had no qualm about just what that would do to him. I feel like Raimi versus Jameson, I don't know if he would do that. I know he wanted to expose Spider-Man, but I just don't know if he would.
I have to wonder, like if Jameson had been on that train that Peter saved, if he had seen him lying on the ground with his mask off, I wonder what Jameson would have thought.
I don't know. That's what I'm saying. It's like, it's kind of an interesting question. And as I talked about earlier, it's interesting to see these characters kind of in the more modern setting. And MCU versus Mr. Jameson is definitely, we could see a lot of what modern media would be like if he were involved in it.
That is really true. Yeah, that is interesting to sort of transplant him into the modern world. And,
the Raimi Jameson, I just wanted to say, kind of piggybacking off of what you said, it's like it just feels very old school because even the way he dresses, it's like a 3-piece suit. He wears the fedora still. It seems like it's almost like he's caught like in the 1950s.
He does wear a fedora in the new one too, though.
True. I feel like in the Raimi verse, I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like he's from an earlier time, and you can tell that things are changing, but he still does things the old-fashioned way. And I feel like that sort of would trickle down into the newsroom. It's a very top-down culture, but as we've seen, there's a certain code, there's a certain sense of right and wrong that comes with that. So.
Yeah, for what it's worth, in the Behind the Mask of Spider-Man behind the scenes book, J.K. Simmons does say that his portrayal of Jameson, he says, quote, he's a good newspaper man in the old world sense, and in the 1960s was a big civil rights advocate, and he treats people equally. He screams at everybody. Like you were sort of saying, he seems like he's sort of stuck in this certain time period. He does seem to have like some sort of moral fiber to him. And it sounds like, Simmons also sort of, intentionally portrays him like that as part of his like the backstory he's constructed in his mind for the character.
It's just an interesting comparison to see what he was like in the Raimi movies versus the more freewheeling or just more modern version of him in the more recent stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, I guess all this is to say, which one would you choose? If you had to work for one of them, which one would it be?
Well, I think when it comes down to it, it's going to have to be Triple J from the Raimi films. Like I said, I think I know him a little bit better. I think I prefer the atmosphere of the newspaper office.
Oh yeah.
And I've seen like just a bit more of his character that I appreciate. So I think it's going to have to be the old flat top for me.
No, I would choose that too. I think, like you said, there's just something kind of exciting about the old school metropolitan newsroom. Just
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I said, like I've been saying, I think there's something kind of old school about the culture of the Daily Bugle in those movies in the Raimi trilogy, and I think it would be kind of fun to be a part of that.
So yeah, okay, for us both, it's going to have to be the good old Daily Bugle of the Raimi world.
And as a bonus, I mean, that newspaper office is in a pretty iconic building, the Flatiron Building, which is one of the very early skyscrapers of New York City. So that's kind of a cool,
That's true.
just a little bonus thing to think about. It's kind of a neat,
Yeah, that is pretty neat too.
place to come to work every day.
All right. So
All right.
Now it falls to me to ask
Lay
you
it on
the
me.
sadistic choice. I don't think there's any easy answer to this one, but Sean, would you rather run into the Green Goblin in a dark alley with or without his mask on? How would you rather encounter the Goblin? Peter says don't go down any dark alleys, but you do.
Well, how am I encountering him? Is he? I guess, like, what's the context of this encounter? If
He's probably got some other agenda. He's probably like waiting to spring on someone else, and you happen to be the wrong person to turn around this alley at the wrong time. You go down a dark alley, and there's the Green Goblin. So would you rather run into him in full Raimi Goblin garb, or as we see him in the Watts movie, with his full freakish face exposed?
All right. I you know what? I'm just going to say I know a lot of people criticize it, but I think that the original Green Goblin costume from Spider-Man 1 with just the Power Ranger suit, whatever you want to call it, I think it's so iconic and so cool. I would rather see him in that. I'd be like, you know what, if this is how I meet my maker, at least, I don't know, like, I think there's something, you know what I mean? Like, if you're going to go down, at least go down at the hands of some maniac wearing this crazy flight suit and this grotesque mask. I mean, I don't know, like, I feel like, people remember that. I mean, I don't think anybody at that Unity Day festival will ever forget it.
Yeah,
I mean, Aunt May, she remember, Rosemary Harris, Aunt May, of course, from the Raimi movies. She remembers very well the yellow eyes, those horrible yellow eyes.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about leaving an impression on people. So
at the same time, though, I think like if I saw that face, he has similarly like searing eyes.
He does.
And that like
it's
terribly
scarier. It's scarier.
malicious smile. I don't know. I might be frozen to the spot if I saw that face in the darkness looking at me so maliciously.
Yeah.
In some ways, it'd be better for me to just see his weird helmet and be like, yeah, I think I'm just going to go the other way.
Yeah.
I think I'd probably be able to mentally process running into someone dressed up like that better with the mask and the suit, I think. Obviously, I would rather not run into the Green Goblin in any dark alley, no matter what he's wearing. I mean, if he was dressed as Little Bo Peep from the Toy Story movies, I still really wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, he does look more cartoony in the original mask from Spider-Man 1. It is more outlandish, so maybe it wouldn't be as scary, or maybe that would make it scarier. I don't know. How many people go in to rob a bank, they wear these crazy masks. It's part of this effort to just completely overwhelm your senses.
Good point. So it looks like we're both going to go with we'd rather run into the Green Goblin down a dark alley with the mask, the classic look.
Yeah.
But sort of for different reasons. Like, I think that the only way that my sanity in the moment would stay with me is if there was something sort of like blocking me from seeing like the full frightful face of Norman Osborn in the throes of the Goblin.
I mean, that would be scary.
But do you think that'd be a cooler way to run into a supervillain, potentially meet your fate?
Yeah, you know what? If you're a supervillain, give me the full supervillain treatment. I want the costume, give me the works,
Hey, that's fair. I respect that.
I respect that. So yeah, that's a good question.
It was a sadistic one. That was definitely a sadistic one.
Yeah, Norman Osborn is he's really good at coming up with that stuff or inspiring those kinds of situations, whether he creates them or whether it's you and me trying to channel that spirit and one-upping each other with these just these scenarios.
The little Goblin juniors that we are.
Exactly. But either way, it's definitely been fun to revisit the Green Goblin in a little bit of detail here, and it's been like I said earlier, it's been a real treat to really reconnect with that character after so many years. It's just been such a pleasure just to be able to do this, honestly, with such a timely movie, just a perfect blend of our childhood nostalgia plus movies that are extremely popular and influential today. So it's been great to do that. And there's still plenty more to do. There's still so much to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. No matter what universe we're in, there is always so much to tell. And as Stephen Strange told Peter 1, the multiverse is a concept about which we know frighteningly little, but we're going to try to understand more of it in the next episode.
Well, and especially we have to talk about Doc Ock's nanotech. We have to talk about the branching timelines. And of course, we have to talk about the man himself, Peter 2. What's he been up to since we last saw him doing Symbiote Night Fever in Spider-Man 3?
I know you can't wait to talk about that, Sean.
So we hope you're as excited as we are about part 2.
We hope everyone listening enjoyed this little dimensional hop with us.
If you're looking for us in the Twitterverse, you just have to open a portal to SMTT Podcast. That's SMTT, as in So Much to Tell Podcast.
But for now,
Godspeed, Spider fans.
All right, yeah. This was good.
Yeah.
We done good here.